Welcome to Tasty History Tidbits. I'm your host, Professor A, and today we're going to be making sourdough pancakes inspired by, well, everybody's favorite treat, sourdough bread. We'll also be discussing the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, which basically demolished the city and made us rethink how we build cities on the West Coast. Let's get started. So for this recipe, you're actually going to need about 1.5 cups of all-purpose flour. You can use whole wheat if you prefer. And then this is about 1.5 cups of sourdough starter. I have been feeding this diligently. If you don't already have starter made, you're going to have to get started on that before you can make these pancakes. Or you can also purchase some. Etsy has a lot of sellers who sell sourdough starter and they ship it to you overnight, so it's nice and yeasty goodness. You're also going to need about a little over 3/4 of a cup of milk. You can use lactose-free if you prefer. Some orange juice. This is about one small orange worth of juice. 2 eggs. Some vanilla extract. That's my favorite. It's from Mexico. And some salt. A little bit of cinnamon. Some melted butter. And then you're also going to need some baking soda and baking powder. Those are going to help leaven the bread a little bit. So to get started, we're going to introduce our sourdough to our flour. And this recipe should be very, very quick because it's for breakfast. And once you have it, you're probably going to want to make extras so you can have it again the next day. And if you want to reheat it, you can do it in the toaster or you can do it in your microwave, however you prefer reheated pancakes. Okay. And we're going to measure in our baking powder, so that you're going to use about a teaspoon of baking powder. Try to make that as level as possible. The trick that my aunt used to use was she would use her knife to help level out things on her thingamabobber. It's language that my mother uses a lot. She always says, "What's that thingy?" And you just have to know. You're also going to need about a teaspoon of baking soda. We're going to use a 1/4 teaspoon to put salt in here. You don't want it to taste too salty. So the salt is really just going to be to enhance the flavor of what's already in here. We're going to do a pinch of cinnamon just to give a little bit of complexity. And even though this is a 1/4 of a teaspoon, I like to make it heaping. It just adds a little complexity to the flavor. And then a 1/2 teaspoon of vanilla. Okay. So now you're going to want to start incorporating these things in slowly. Now it's important because this does have yeast in it and the yeast is alive because it is in your sourdough, that when you pour your butter in, it is not too hot. So let your butter warm up a little bit after you've cool down a little bit after you've melted it. All right, so now that my ingredients are mixed together, it should be clumpy, and that's okay, because that's literally just the sourdough just kind of grabbing hold of the flour and stuff. So now we're going to start adding our wet ingredients to this. So we're going to get our eggs in here. And you know, a really good way to save your eggs is if you have a garden, you can actually use your eggshells to help fertilize your garden. There's actually this recipe called cascarilla powder, and it's used with ground up eggshells, and it's very good for your plants. All right, We're going to throw in our butter. Do our orange juice. The orange juice is really going to serve two purposes here. It's going to help give it a nice little hint of orange, but also it's going to sweeten it without using sugar, in case you don't use syrup on your pancakes. I'm going to pour our milk in. And we're just going to make sure this is nice and battery. And we're going to finish out our orange juice. I like to just kind of gauge how wet it is before I put all of the orange juice in. You can use a whisk, a spoon to do this part. And while I get this mixed up, let's get to the history. Imagine being woken up in the wee hours of the morning in April 1906. You look at the clock. It's shortly after 5 o'clock in the morning. And you felt a little shaking. It didn't last long, and you know that there are little tremors from time to time, so you don't think much about it. But approximately 30 seconds later, you feel something big. It is the biggest tremor you've ever felt. Your whole house feels like it's going to fall down any moment. That's what happened to the people of San Francisco Bay in 1906 at approximately 5:12 a.m. With very little warning. They experienced one of the largest earthquakes to have ever occurred in the United States. And to this day, the 1906 earthquake is still significant, not only for the cause of the destructions, especially from the subsequent fires, but because it led to the beginning of us understanding geology and earthquake science and earthquake cycles and how tectonic plates work. On April 18, 1906, the city of San Francisco was nearly totally destroyed by the earthquake, and it only lasted approximately a minute or so, and the ensuing fire. It was beyond the experience or imagination of anyone alive during the time period, because San Francisco and the surrounding areas that lie along the San Andreas Fault had experienced large earthquakes, particularly in 1838, 1865, and 1868. But those were nothing compared to the 7.9 magnitude earthquake that struck that day. And it ruptured nearly 270 miles of the then unknown San Andreas Fault. The fire that came after the earthquake destroyed much of San Francisco's infrastructure. There were indeed a lot of residential areas that were left intact, but due to the poor Victorian architectural construction practices, loose bricks, wood construction, many of the downtown structures were destroyed. Of course, there are a number of first-hand accounts, including one of a Mrs. Eleanor Watkins. She was the wife of a San Francisco surgeon, and she relayed her observations in a letter to her relatives in Virginia about what happened that day. She said, quote, "After the earthquake, the streets were instantly full of throngs of people, many in their night clothes. The sun was rising red behind a queer brown cloud. I said, that is the typical sun of earthquakes and cyclones that we read about. In a few moments, I noticed 5 billowy columns rising in this queer cloud in different directions, and I realized it was smoke. The great fire had begun, though no one realized what it would be. We had heard people calling, 'Look at the powerhouse! Look at the city hall!' The powerhouse was within a square of us, one of 3 in the city. Its tower had fallen and mashed in the roof. The city hall was straight down Hyde Street, about 6 squares from us. It was granite and occupied a square, a magnificent building. The dome was standing, This was the Hall of Records, which fortunately contained the city's most valuable records and tile papers, but the rest was a pile of ruins. The effects of the earthquake were in spots, not universal. We saw whole fonts of office buildings and of assembly halls fallen outward. Sometimes the asphalt pavement had heaved up in a hillcock where the gas had exploded. We heard that the old Valencia Street Hotel in the Mission had sunk 20 feet, collapsed, and killed 50 people. This was true. It had the severest shock in San Francisco. The handsome residence district on Pacific Heights overlooking the ocean was scarcely injured, except some fallen chimneys. As we crossed Union Square to the St. Francis Hotel, the crowd came in surges, and Union Square was full of poor people who had fled from the fire south of Market Street, where the poorest people lived. Around them were piled trunks and bundles, parrots and babies. A woman had fainted at the corner and was lying in the grass on the crowd. Strange to say, the Statue of Victory, which is perched on one toe at the top of a column 100 feet high in Union Square, was uninjured. We went into the St. Francis to find its lobby crowded with dress suitcases and tourists who were begging for carriages or wagons to take the ferry. The ornate ceiling, the frescoes and carvings were broken at every corner, and the waiters too, excited to bring us anything but coffee. We collected rolls, sugar, knives, and forks and spoons from other uncleared tables. The coffee braced us up, for I was on the verge of tears over the homeless people in Union Square, little thinking that I should soon be one of them. We walked down to Market Street, the chief business street of the city. On Mission Street, next south of Market, about 6 squares were burning. Let me draw a rough sketch of the city, of course inaccurate. It is, at the end of a peninsula. Market Street divides the city diagonally in two. South of it were the residents of the poor people and wholesale houses, and at the end of it was the ferry building. It was the main business street and held most of the skyscrapers, the newspaper buildings, office building, large hotels, government buildings, and it began the business section, which extended further north along Kearny, Montgomery, Grant Avenue, etc., holding the great shops, importing houses, etc. South of it were the post office and the Mint, almost the only large buildings to be saved from the fire, and they were only by marvelously heroic fighting. We saw the flames burst through the windows of the first building to burn on Market. We saw the fight to save the Palace Hotel, a historic landmark. We saw a fire break out on each side of Market between us and the ferry. We saw the troops coming and the first dynamite brought, and still no one thought of the fire spreading to the northern part of the city. The water mains were broken by the earthquake. There was no water. The soldiers were dynamiting the buildings along the fire lines, so we decided to go home and make sure our insurance papers and jewelry were safe. Even then, our friends laughed at us. It was a strange obsession. No one seemed to realize that there was no water, and each one believed that the fire could not reach him. Most people escaped with only the clothes that they wore. When the fire was within 2 squares of us, a woman in our house declared that our house could not burn and she would not pack her clothes. The very poor could pack their possessions in a trunk and drag it with a rope along the pavement for miles. I shall never forget the sound of dragging trunks all night long. Some of the rich people saved their houses, for this 1/4 of the city which still stands was one of the richest sections, but they suffered most in the business section. One of my ex-rich friends with a big house is already trying to get boarders. We got our papers, life insurance, fire insurance, burglar insurance, and a few shirts in Eastern Company, bank books, checkbooks, our jewelry, and what cash we had in this house. All this we concealed on our persons. I had almost $200. This was the only cash in the house. On this money we and 6 other families have been living since the earthquake. I have heard of only one other person who saved so much cash. Men who were millionaires had only $1 or $2. I heard one young fellow remark cheerfully that he had lost everything and had 25 cents in his pocket, but that he was young and did not need money. The spirit of this people is the most wonderful thing I ever dreamed of. Cheerful, happy, laughing, while they were fleeing from the flames, saying nothing of what they had lost, but rejoicing over their lives. I have seen one woman fainting and one in tears. That is all. Humanity has showed up well. I am proud to call myself a San Franciscan. Though the official death rate will never be known, it is guessed to be at around 2,000 people. This is comparatively small when there are 300,000 homeless in San Francisco. If the earthquake had happened another 2 or 3 hours later when businesses were open, there would be thousands more deaths in the business buildings and on the streets. And of course, while we still remember the damage that this earthquake and the subsequent fires did, that is not where its greatest legacy is. In the years following the San Francisco earthquake, a scientist named Reed developed his elastic theory, which is still used in predicting earthquake cycles today. And it also gave rise to studying plate tectonics and fault lines, which we grew to better understand approximately half a century later, when we understood how tectonic plates actually work and move and induce earthquakes. Now that this is all mixed up, we went ahead and prepared our griddle. I have an electric griddle and it's preheated to 350 degrees, and I put some butter on it to melt and let it get all nice and slippery. If you don't have an electric griddle, you can always use your stove with a nice pan on the stove. Just make sure that it gets warm before you start putting your pancake dough on it, and as well as the pan is buttered. You can use something like baker's dough, which doesn't have a flavor. I don't recommend Pam because Pam does actually have a flavor, or you can use straight up butter. And we're going to measure out about 1/3 of a cup of our batter and just stick it on there. And from this point on, it's just regular old pancake mixing. So I will get these going, and we're going to do the magic of YouTube and do a fast forward, so that way you can get to the tasty results. Make sure they're nice and golden brown when you take them off though. And voila! Beautiful sourdough pancakes. I topped mine with a little bit of blueberry. Let's give them a taste. Yep, these definitely hit the spot. They're not sour in the least bit, like you would think maybe because there's sourdough in it, but they're not sour at all. In fact, they just taste like beautiful, fluffy, filling pancakes. Yep, this is a great recipe. So if you'd like to try your hand at this recipe, go ahead and take a picture when you're done and tag us on Instagram at Tasty History Tidbits and let me know how you like it. And I hope to see you in the next one. Have a great rest of your week.